The ink in the inkwell had gone thick with the evening chill, and Frances Elliot was beginning to suspect that her father's ledgers were more work of fiction than finance. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to rub away the image of the red ink columns that seemed to grow longer with every guttering of her candle. The twilight filtered through the cracked panes of Elliot Manor, catching the dust motes that danced between the fraying tapestries and stacks of unsold heirlooms. Somewhere in the draughty hall, a loose shutter banged against the stone, sounding like a gavel bringing a final sentence down on her family's name. "The neighbors will return from the season to find me catalogued as an antique and organized by the rats," Frances muttered, abandoning the accounts to latch the window. She had made it halfway across the room when a sound erupted from the rose garden below, a wet, heavy thud followed by a sharp, pained intake of breath. Frances paused, her hand hovering over the silver latch. The moors were always noisy at night. The wind howling through the gorse, the occasional fox, the distant clatter of a coach on the high road. But this was different, heavier, more human. "I swerved him by the creek. Swear he took a lead ball to the side." "You're certain?" "Because if the Duke's man gets to the city with that letter, the magistrate will have our heads." Frances moved to the window, pressing close enough to the glass that her breath fogged it. 3 men in dark, nondescript greatcoats stood at the edge of the stone terrace, their lanterns swinging in wide, searching arcs. They were looking for something, someone, in the tangle of unpruned thorns. At the center of the garden, a figure lay collapsed against a stone sundial. Even in the gloom, she could see the dark stains spreading across his light-colored tunic, the way his fingers clutched at the earth in a desperate attempt to rise. Something in her chest tightened. She recognized that desperation. The physical language of a hunted thing trying to find cover where there was none. "Check the stables," the largest of the 3 men growled, his voice carrying through the glass. "He couldn't have gone far. No man bleeds that much and stays standing." Frances's fingers curled against the window frame. She should stay back. Her family was already a breath away from ruin. Being caught harboring a fugitive, especially one the magistrate was hunting, would be a traitor's death. Her father's last letter had warned her 100 times, "You cannot fix this world, Frances. Your mercy is the only thing that will get you hurt." But she had also seen what happened when mercy was withheld. When everyone decided that a dying stranger wasn't worth the risk, the dark won. Frances grabbed a heavy wool shawl, threw it over her shoulders, and slipped out the side door into the rain. The night air hit her, smelling of wet earth and copper. The men hadn't noticed her yet, their lanterns bobbing toward the outbuildings. Her mind raced. She needed something to throw them off the scent, something that would buy the stranger enough time to disappear into the house. She closed the distance in 10 silent strides. The stranger's eyes flew open as she reached him. They were dark, she noticed, piercing and wild with a lethal intensity. Up close, he was broader than she'd expected, with a jawline that suggested command and eyes that belonged to a man who had never asked for help in his life. "Don't move," Frances whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stranger stared at her like she was an apparition. He opened his mouth, perhaps to warn her or to threaten her, but Frances didn't give him the chance. She leaned down, grabbing his mud-stained lapels to pull his weight toward her, and pressed her hand firmly over his mouth to stifle his groan of pain. "Quiet," she breathed into his ear as the lantern swung back toward them. "Unless you want them to finish what they started." For one frozen heartbeat, nothing happened. His body was a wall of tense muscle and heat against hers, and Frances's brain finally caught up with the terrifying scale of what she had just invited into her bedroom. Hello, lovely fanatic of Victorian love stories. Hit the like and subscribe button. It helps me bring you move tales of love, longing, and history. And if you are up for it, tell me where you are watching from in the comment section. Now let's dive back into our story. The ink in the inkwell had gone thick with the evening chill, and Frances Elliot was beginning to suspect that her father's ledgers were more work of fiction than finance. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to rub away the image of the red-inked columns that seemed to grow longer with every guttering of her candle. The twilight filtered through the cracked panes of Elliot Manor, catching the dust motes that danced between the fraying tapestries and stacks of unsold heirlooms. Somewhere in the draughty hall, a loose shutter banged against the stone, sounding like a gavel bringing a final sentence down on her family's name. The neighbors will return from the season to find me catalogued as an antique and organized by the rats, Frances muttered, abandoning the accounts to latch the window. She had made it halfway across the room when a sound erupted from the rose garden below, a wet, heavy thud followed by a sharp, pained intake of breath. Frances paused, her hand hovering over the silver latch. The moors were always noisy at night, but this was different, heavier, more human. Through the fog glass, she saw 3 men in dark greatcoats with swinging lanterns. They were looking for someone in the tangle of unpruned thorns. At the center of the garden, a figure lay collapsed against a stone sundial, a dark stain spreading across his light-colored tunic. "Check the stables," the largest of the men growled. "He couldn't have gone far." Frances's fingers curled against the window frame. Her father's last letter had warned her that her mercy would be the only thing to get her hurt, but she had seen what happened when everyone decided a dying stranger wasn't worth the risk. She grabbed a heavy wool shawl, threw it over her shoulders, and slipped out the side door into the rain. She closed the distance in 10 silent strides. The stranger's eyes flew open as she reached him, dark, piercing, and wild with a lethal intensity. "Don't move," Frances whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He opened his mouth, but Frances didn't give him the chance. She leaned down, grabbing his mud-stained lapels to pull his weight toward her, and pressed her hand firmly over his mouth to stifle his groan of pain. "Quiet," she breathed into his ear as the lantern swung back toward them. "Unless you want them to finish what they started." For one frozen heartbeat, his body was a wall of tense muscle and heat against hers. With a strength born of desperation, she hauled his arm over her shoulder and began the agonizing trek toward the servants' entrance. Every step was a gamble against the light of the lanterns behind them. They reached the heavy oak door just as a shout erupted from the garden. Frances dragged him inside, up the narrow back stairs, and into the sanctuary of a bedchamber, collapsing onto the rug just as a thunderous pounding began at the front door. Magistrate Holloway had arrived. The air in the bedchamber was thick with the scent of rain, metallic blood, and the lavender sachet tucked beneath Frances's pillow. On the floor, the man she had dragged from the mud lay half-conscious, his breathing a shallow, ragged whistle that seemed to sync with the frantic thudding of the magistrate's fist against the manor's front door downstairs. Frances didn't dare light a candle. The sliver of moonlight cutting through the velvet curtains was her only guide. She moved with a desperate, quiet efficiency, stripping away the blood-soaked linen of his tunic to reveal a jagged furrow across his ribs where a lead ball had grazed him. Her hands trembled as she dipped a scrap of silk into a basin of water. Each time she pressed the cloth to the wound, Solomon's body jerked with a violent, instinctive tension, his fingers digging into the plush rug. "Shush," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the dark. "If you cry out, you give Holloway a reason to break down my door." Solomon's eyes snapped open, dark and unfocused, catching the moonlight. In his delirium, he reached up, his hand, strong and calloused despite the elegance of his signet ring, locking around her wrist with bruising strength. For a heartbeat, they were frozen, the disgraced daughter of a baronet and the hunted duke, bound together by the secret of his survival. The danger felt physical, a heavy weight pressing down on them as the muffled shouts of the magistrate's men echoed through the floorboards. "Why?" he rasped, the single word choked with pain and suspicion. He looked at her not as a savior, but as another potential blade in the dark. "Because I know what it is like to be hunted by men who don't care for the truth," Frances replied, her defensive pride flaring even in the shadows. She didn't pull away from his grip. Instead, she leaned closer, her hair falling like a veil between them. "And because my bedchamber is the only place in this county where the law doesn't reach without an invitation." Slowly, the lethal tension left his frame. His fingers uncoiled from her wrist, slipping down to rest against her palm. It was a surrender, a moment of raw, unvarnished vulnerability that shattered the walls she had built around her heart. She finished binding his side with strips of her own silk shift, the fine material a stark contrast to the rugged violence of his injury. As his breathing finally leveled into a pained sleep, Frances remained on the floor beside him, her hand still ghosting Near's. She was a woman who had spent years guarding her isolation, yet in the silence of the night, she realized she was no longer alone in her fortress. The magistrate was still prowling the halls below, but the real storm was now inside her room, sleeping fitfully against her silk skates. The first grey light of dawn filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, turning the room into a theatre of cold shadows and sharpening the scent of dried blood. Frances had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep in the wingback chair beside the bed, but the sound of a sharp, metallic click snapped her awake. Solomon was no longer the limp weight she had dragged from the garden. He was sitting upright against the headboard, his face a pale, lethal mask of concentration. Despite the silk bandages she had painstakingly wrapped around his torso, he held himself with a terrifying, coiled energy, and in his hand was a small, ornate dagger he had pulled from the lining of his boot. "Who else knows I am here?" he asked, his voice no longer a rasp but a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room. His eyes, dark and unyielding, tracked her every movement with the predatory precision of a hawk. Frances stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirts and forcing her voice to remain steady. "The magistrate's men searched the foyer and the library. They believe you vanished into the moors. If anyone else knew, the doors would have been kicked in hours ago." She stepped toward the wash-basin, refusing to flinch under his scrutiny. "You are in Elliott Manor. You are safe, for as long as I decide to keep you so." Solomon's gaze didn't soften, but he lowered the blade an inch. "Safe is a relative term, Miss Elliott. Safety is usually just a prelude to a different kind of trap." He moved to adjust his position, a hiss of pain escaping his teeth as the wound pulled. As he reached for the edge of the nightstand to steady himself, his hand caught the light of the rising sun. There, on his right hand, sat a heavy gold signet ring. The crest was unmistakable, a rising phoenix crowned by a ducal coronet. It was the seal of the Ashworth line, a symbol of power so absolute it could move armies or erase entire families with a single stamp of wax. Frances felt the blood drain from her face as the realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a soldier or man caught in a rebellion. This was Solomon Monroe, the Iron Duke of Ashworth. He was the man whose signature had authorized the seizure of her father's properties, the architect of her family's long, slow descent into the shadows. "Ashworth," she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp clarity. The gratitude she had felt for saving a life curdled into a cold, defensive pride. She looked from the ring to the man who wore it, seeing him now not as a wounded stranger, but as the very embodiment of the system that had broken her world. Solomon saw the recognition in her eyes, and his jaw tightened, the mask of the Duke sliding back into place over the man she had tended in the dark. "Now you know the secret, Frances, and you know why they are so desperate to find me." He leaned back, the dagger still resting against the silk sheets. "The question is, does the daughter of a ruined baronet want justice, or does she want revenge? Because that ring can buy you both, or it can be the last thing you ever see." The thunder of the front door knocker reverberated through the floorboards, a rhythmic, violent intrusion that shattered the tense silence of the bedchamber. Frances didn't need to look out the window to know that the dawn had brought Magistrate Halloway back, and this time he wouldn't be satisfied with a cursory glance at the foyer. "The panel behind the headboard," Frances whispered, her voice tight as she gestured toward the carved oak wainscoting. "It leads to the old priest's hole. It is cramped and smells of damp stone, but it is the only place in this house they haven't found yet." Solomon didn't hesitate. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his face tightening as the movement tore at his fresh dressings. Even wounded and half-naked, he moved with a grim, military efficiency. He paused at the edge of the hidden door, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, searing intensity. "If they find me, Frances, tell them I broke in. Tell them I held you at knife point. Do not let my shadow pull you into the grave." "Just get in," she urged, pushing against his shoulder as the shouting from downstairs grew louder. The panel clicked shut, sealing the Duke of Ashworth into the darkness just as the heavy tread of boots reached the landing. Frances barely had time to scramble into her dressing gown and muss her hair before the bedroom door was flung open. Magistrate Halloway stood on the threshold, his face a mask of bureaucratic arrogance, flanked by two men carrying heavy truncheons. The scent of rain and wet wool flooded the room, clashing with the lingering copper tang of Solomon's blood. "Magistrate," Frances said, her voice dripping with a cold, aristocratic disdain she hadn't used in years. She stood in front of the bed, her shadow shielding the faint indentation on the pillows. To what do I owe this vulgar intrusion? Surely the law does not require you to burst into a lady's private chambers at such an ungodly hour." Holloway's eyes swept the room, sharp and predatory. He didn't look at her, he looked at the wardrobe, the curtains, and the dark corners of the ceiling. "A dangerous man was seen on your lands, Miss Elliot. A traitor to the crown. We tracked his blood to your garden, and the trail ends at your side door." He stepped closer, his presence a physical threat. "I find it curious that a woman of your precarious standing would be sleeping so soundly while a murderer prowls her hallways." "If a murderer were in my hallways, magistrate, I would be screaming for the watch, not entertaining a man who refuses to remove his hat in my presence," she countered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Holloway signaled his men, who began a systematic destruction of her privacy. They overturned the washstand, slashed through the heavy velvet hangings of the bed, and threw open the wardrobe with a deafening crash. Frances remained motionless, her spine a rigid line of defiance. She watched as Holloway approached the very wall where Solomon was hidden, his gloved hand tracing the intricate carvings of the oak. He paused, his knuckles rapping against the wood. The sound was hollow. Frances didn't breathe. She forced herself to look through him, maintaining the look of a duchess she had learned from a lifetime of being looked down upon. "Is there something behind my headboard that interests you, or are you simply fond of my woodwork?" Holloway lingered, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face for a flinch, a tremor, or a lie. But Frances Elliot had been hiding her shame for years. Hiding a duke was merely a matter of scale. Finally, he pulled his hand away, a sneer curling his lip. "We shall find him, Miss Elliot. And when we do, I shall remember exactly how helpful you were this morning." As the door slammed shut and the sound of their boots faded down the hall, Frances collapsed against the bedpost, her lungs finally drawing air. The vultures had circled, but the fortress had held. The days that followed turned the bedchamber into a world of its own, a silent island adrift in a sea of suspicion. Solomon's fever eventually broke, leaving him with a sharp, observant lucidity that was almost as unnerving as his previous delirium. Because the magistrates' men still patrolled the perimeter of the estate, Solomon remained confined to the room, his presence a constant, heavy weight against the delicate patterns of Frances's daily life. The air between them grew thick, not just with the scent of medicinal herbs, but with a tension that neither was prepared to name. Solomon sat by the fire, his bandaged torso draped in a borrowed robe that looked absurdly small on his broad shoulders. He watched Frances as she mended a frayed hem, her movements precise and graceful. "You handle that needle like a weapon, Miss Elliot," he remarked, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "I suspect you've had to defend yourself with less." Frances didn't look up, though the tips of her ears pinked. In this house, one learns that the smallest tools are often the most vital. "I've mended my pride as often as I've mended these skates." She paused, her gaze shifting to the window where the moors stretched out in an endless, lonely gray. "My father always said duty was the only thing that couldn't be taken from us, even after you signed the order that stripped us of the rest." Solomon's expression shifted, the hard lines of the duke softening into a weary sincerity. "The order was a necessity of the crown, Frances. I was a man of duty then, seeing only the signatures on a page, not the lives they erased. Exile is a cold mistress, is it not? I spent years in the borderlands, hunting ghosts and sleeping on stone, wondering if the man I was protecting even remembered my name." "Then we are both ghosts," Frances murmured, finally meeting his eyes. "Living in the ruins of what we were supposed to be." The confession hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Solomon reached out, his hand, larger and warmer than any she had ever known, resting over hers on the small table. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. The contact was electric, a grounding force in a world where everything else was shifting. For a moment, the Duke of Ashworth was gone, and there was only Solomon, a man who had seen too much war, and Frances, a woman who had seen too much loss. "I didn't expect to find a heart in the house of a man I ruined," he whispered, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate line over her knuckles. The intimacy of the gesture was more startling than his dagger had been. It was an invitation into a different kind of danger, one that had nothing to do with the magistrate and everything to do with the way his gaze lingered on the curve of her throat. Frances felt the walls of her self-sacrificing isolation begin to crumble. She had spent so long being the guardian of her family shame that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a woman. The spark of tension between them flared, hot and bright, making the room feel smaller, the fire warmer, and the outside world a distant, fading memory. They were still fugitives, but in the quiet of the bedchamber, they were discovering that the most dangerous secret they held wasn't the rebellion, but the way their breaths hitched in the shared silence. The fire had burned down to a heap of glowing embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room as Solomon fell into a heavy, medicinal sleep. It was then that Frances noticed the discarded tunic she had hidden at the bottom of her wardrobe, still stiff with the salt of the moles and the copper of his blood. As she moved to soak the garment, her fingers brushed against a stiffness in the lining that didn't feel like dried gall. With a sharp tug, she unraveled a concealed seam, and a single, folded parchment tumbled onto the rug. The wax seal was broken, a jagged smear of black that bore no crest, yet the paper felt heavy and expensive beneath her touch. As she unfolded it, the air in the room seemed to grow thin. It wasn't a letter of love or a simple military order. It was a map of the capital, marked with chilling precision. Red ink traced the path to the king's private chambers, and beneath the diagram were the signatures of men she had seen at court, men who toasted the crown by day and, according to this ink, plotted its decapitation by night. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Solomon hadn't been fleeing highwaymen. He was the sole courier of a coup that had already taken root in the highest offices of the land. His death in her garden wouldn't have been a tragedy of a single soul. It would have been the silent signal for the kingdom to burn. She looked at the man sleeping fitfully on her bed, his face pale and etched with the strain of his burden. He was the only barrier between the world she knew and a tide of blood. Her gaze drifted to the list of names at the bottom of the page. Near the end, written in a cramped, arrogant hand, was the signature of Magistrate Holloway. The cold efficiency of the man's searches suddenly made sense. He wasn't looking for a traitor. He was looking for the evidence of his own treason. If Holloway found them, there would be no trial, no mercy, and no history left to tell the tale of the Elliot family's final stand. Frances clutched the letter to her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent years resenting the Duke of Ashworth for the stroke of a pen that ruined her father, but now she held a piece of paper that could end a dynasty. The self-sacrificing isolation she had cultivated was no longer a shield. It was a prison. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she couldn't just hide Solomon Monroe anymore. She had to save him, because if the Duke fell, the kingdom fell with him, and she would be the one holding the ashes. She moved back to the bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the weight of the secret pressing down on her like a physical hand. The spark of romantic tension that had flickered between them was now shadowed by the cold reality of the gallows. She wasn't just a nurse to a wounded man. She was the guardian of the throne, tucked away in a decaying manor while the vultures circled closer. The moon was a sharp, silver blade cutting through the heavy mist of the moors as Frances led Solomon toward the ancient stone bridge at the edge of the estate. He walked with a slight limp, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder for support, his breath hitching as the cold air bit into his healing side. They moved like shadows through the overgrown gardens, avoiding the open paths where the magistrates' patrols might catch the glint of steel or the rustle of silk. The Bridge of Sighs, a crumbling relic of a family's former grandeur, felt like the only place left where the walls didn't have ears. A sudden snap of a twig echoed from the tree line, sharp as a pistol shot. Solomon's reaction was instantaneous. He pulled Frances into the hollow beneath the bridge's stone arch, his body a hot, protective shield against hairs. He pressed his hand over her mouth, his eyes scanning the dark with a lethal, focused intensity that made her blood run cold. They stood in the damp silence, heartbeats thudding against one another, until the source of the noise, a stray deer, bolted into the brush. "You move like a soldier even when you are half broken," Frances whispered as he finally released her. She leaned back against the wet stone, her chest heaving. "But why did you do it, Solomon? Why did the man who fights for the crown with such ferocity destroy a family like mine? My father was no traitor." Solomon looked out at the sluggish water of the creek, his profile etched in harsh light. The mask of the Iron Duke seemed to crack, revealing a weariness that went deeper than his recent wounds. He wasn't a traitor, Frances. He was a fool. He had discovered the early tremors of the rebellion, the same one I am fighting now. But he was loud, and he was careless. He tried to blackmail men who eat hearts for breakfast. He turned to her, his dark eyes brimming with a raw, painful sincerity. "Holloway didn't want him exiled. He wanted him dead. He wanted your entire line erased to ensure their secret stayed buried. I signed the order of exile not to ruin your father, but to put him beyond Holloway's reach. I stripped him of his title so he would be beneath their notice. I chose a living shame for your family over a silent grave. The revelation shattered the last of her defensive pride. All these years, she had carried her resentment like a holy relic, unaware that the man she blamed for her poverty had been the one to grant her a life at all. The isolation she had cultivated felt suddenly hollow. "You let us hate you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "You let me look at you with loathing while you carried that burden alone." "It was the only way to make the lie believable," Solomon said, stepping closer until the heat of his presence drowned out the damp chill of the bridge. He reached out, his hand ghosting along the line of her jaw. "I have spent my life making choices that leave me in the dark. I didn't expect to find a light like you in the ruins I created." In the shadow of the bridge, the distance between the Duke and the daughter of the disgraced baronet vanished completely. The danger was still out there, circling the manor with lanterns and steel, but as Solomon leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, the only thing that mattered was the truth they had finally found in the silence. The sanctuary of the bedchamber, once a fortress of shared whispers and healing, was breached by a different kind of weapon, a lie designed to rot. By the third day following their night at the bridge, the isolation of Elliott Manor was shattered not by boots, but by the silence of the village. The local merchants, who usually braved the long drive to sell meager supplies, stopped appearing at the gates. When Frances finally ventured to the edge of the estate, she found the town crier's echoes and the sharp, sidelong glances of the parish women. Holloway had been busy. He didn't need to find a duke to destroy Frances, he only needed to find a scandal. The rumor was a masterful piece of character assassination, whispered into every influential A from the tavern to the church pews. It claimed that the pious Frances Elliott had finally succumbed to the wild blood of her disgraced lineage, harboring a nameless, low-born lover within her private quarters, a man of no character who had allegedly been seen slipping through her terrace doors under the cover of a storm. "He is trying to smoke us out," Solomon said, standing by the fireplace as Frances recounted the icy reception she had received at the gates. His jaw was set in a hard, dangerous line, his fingers twitching toward the empty space where his sword should have been. "If he ruins your reputation, he strips you of the community's protection. He makes it so that when he finally breaks down this door, no one will lift a finger to help the fallen woman of Elliott Manor." Frances stood by the window, her hand gripping the fraying velvet curtain until her knuckles turned white. The defensive pride that had kept her upright for years felt like a target painted on her chest. "He knows the village looks to me for a shred of the dignity my father once provided. If he turns them against me, I have no shield left. He isn't just looking for you anymore, Solomon. He is punishing me for the crime of being unbreakable." The cruelty of the tactic was precise. By painting her as a woman of easy virtue, Holloway was ensuring that any plea she made to the neighboring gentry for help would be met with closed doors and averted eyes. He was turning her refuge into a cage of shame, betting that the weight of the social exile would force her to flee, or better yet, to hand over the man he suspected she was hiding just to save what was left of her name. "I will not let him do this," Solomon murmured, stepping into the dim light. He reached out, his hand steadying hers against the curtain. "A duke's word carries weight, even from the shadows. If he wants a scandal, we shall give him a reckoning instead." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the moors in an ominous, bruised purple, Frances felt the noose tightening. Holloway's rumor was a poison in the well, and the villagers were already beginning to gather at the edge of the property, their torches flickering like distant, hungry eyes. The magistrate had realized that while he couldn't prove a duke was in her bed, he could make sure the world believed she wasn't worth saving. The heavy mist of the moors seemed to seep through the very floorboards of the manor, bringing with it a chill that no hearth fire could truly dispel. It was during this oppressive silence that a frantic pounding erupted at the kitchen door, delivering a messenger who bore a tattered scrap of parchment sealed with a ring Frances had not seen in years. Her breath hitched as she recognized the specific, jagged crest of her father's minor house. The note was brief, written in a trembling, familiar hand. "I have returned in secret. I am injured and hiding at the old miller's cottage. Come alone, Frances, or the magistrate's men will finish what they started." "It is his hand, Solomon," Frances whispered, her fingers shaking as she held the letter near the guttering candle. The defensive pride she had maintained for so long was suddenly eclipsed by a primal, filial terror. "He is back. If Holloway finds him before I do, he will use my father to get to you, or Weiss." Solomon stepped out of the shadows, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the parchment. The Duke's instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of the court, flared with immediate suspicion. The timing is too perfect, Francis. Holloway's rumors failed to smoke us out, so now he reaches for the one string left in your heart. It is a lure. And if it isn't? Francis countered, her voice rising with a desperate edge. If he is truly there, bleeding in the cold because he tried to come back for me, I cannot sit in this room and wait for his death while I play nurse to a duke. The conflict between them was a taut wire. Solomon reached for her, his grip on her shoulders firm and grounding. If you leave this manor, you leave the only sanctuary we have. The moment you cross the threshold of that cottage, the magistrates' men will be through these windows. They don't want your father, Francis. They want me, and they are using your love as the key to the lock. But the self-sacrificing isolation that had defined Francis for years made the choice for her. She couldn't risk the ghost of her father for the reality of the Duke. Despite Solomon's warnings, she threw her heavy wool shawl over her shoulders and slipped into the night, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The ride to the miller's cottage was a blur of shadows and silver moonlight. The woods felt alive, the snapping of twigs sounding like the cocking of pistols. When she finally reached the derelict stone structure, she found no father, no blood, and no warmth. Instead, the door swung open to reveal the cold, triumphant silhouette of Magistrate Holloway, standing amidst a circle of armed men. A predictable heart is a very easy thing to hunt, Miss Elliot, Holloway purred, his voice dripping with a lethal satisfaction. Back at the manor, the silence was shattered as the first window pane broke. Solomon, hearing the approach of boots on the gravel, realized the trap had sprung perfectly. He was trapped in a room that had become a cage, his protector lured into the dark, and the vultures were no longer circling, they were inside. The cold realization of Holloway's trap felt like a shroud as the magistrates' men escorted Frances back to the manor, their torches casting flickering, demonic shadows against the stones of her home. The front doors had been kicked wide, the heavy oak splintered, a final violation of the sanctuary she had fought so hard to maintain. Inside, the great hall was filled with the smell of wet wool and the sharp, ozone tang of impending violence. Solomon stood at the top of the stairs, his dark silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight of the landing, looking every bit the Iron Duke, even as his blood seeped through the fresh bandages. Holloway shoved Frances forward into the center of the hall, his hand tight on her arm. "The game is over, Miss Elliot," he sneered, looking up at the man on the stairs. "I have the girl, and I have the perimeter. There is no secret passage left that leads to safety. Hand over the letter, and perhaps I'll let the lady live long enough to see your execution." Solomon didn't look at Holloway, his gaze was fixed entirely on Francis. In that moment, the distance between them vanished, replaced by a raw, terrifying clarity. "Francis," he called out, his voice echoing with a command that made the magistrates' men flinch. "Listen to me. Holloway wants the proof of his treason. If you walk away now, if you tell them you were a victim of my coercion, that I held you in that room against your will, I will confirm the lie. I will give him the Duke of Ashworth on a silver platter if it means you walk out of these doors alive." He stepped down the first few stairs, his hand reaching into his tunic to produce the black-sealed parchment. "I am the one they want. I am the man who signed your father's pain. Use my life as the currency to buy your future. Take the horse in the stable and don't look back." Frances looked from the letter to the man who held it. The self-sacrificing isolation that had been her armor for years finally shattered, leaving behind something far more dangerous, a fierce, unyielding devotion. She saw the Duke of Ashworth, the man who had protected her family in secret, and she saw Solomon, the man who had found a heart in the ruins of her life. "No," Frances said, her voice ringing through the hall with a defiance that silenced the room. She wrenched her arm away from Holloway's grip and stepped toward the stairs, toward the man who had ruined her and saved her all at once. "You told me once that exile is a cold mistress, Solomon. I will not be exiled from you. If this manor is to be our tomb, then let the vultures see how an Elliot and an Ashworth stand together." She reached the bottom of the stairs and held out her hand to him. Solomon's expression broke, a flicker of agony followed by a surge of pride so potent it seemed to steady his wounded frame. He took her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers, and turned his gaze toward Holloway with the lethal coldness of a winter storm. The unmasking was complete. They were no longer a fugitive and a nurse, they were a united front against the tide of treason. The air in the great hall curdled with the scent of spent gunpowder and ancient dust as Holloway's men surged forward. Solomon's hand tightened on Hayes for a fraction of a second, a silent promise, before he lunged into the fray with a predatory grace that defied his injury. He moved like a whirlwind of midnight velvet and tempered steel, his saber whistling through the air to meet the first wave of attackers. But they were outnumbered, and the circle of steel was closing in around the center of the hall. The cellar, Solomon. The foundations. Frances cried out, her voice cutting through the clash of blades. She didn't wait for him to question her. She grabbed a heavy iron candelabra from a side table, swinging it with a desperate, practiced strength to ward off a lunging rebel. She knew every rotting joist and hidden flaw in Elliott Manor's decaying bones, a knowledge born of years spent tending to a house she couldn't afford to fix. She led him toward the back of the hall, where the massive, ancient oak chandelier hung low over the center of the room. The mechanism was a relic of the 16th century, a rusted iron counterweight hidden behind the tapestries of the north wall. "Hold them at the hearth," she commanded. Solomon pivoted, his back to the massive stone fireplace, his blade parrying 3 swords at once in a frantic, sparks-flying rhythm that bought her the seconds she needed. Frances dove behind the heavy velvet hangings, her fingers clawing at the recessed lever she had discovered as a child. It was jammed with age and neglect. Outside the curtain, she heard Solomon grunt in pain as a blade found his shoulder, the sound of his labord breathing a spur to her side. With a primal scream of defiance, she threw her entire weight against the lever. The sound was like a thunderclap, the snap of a rusted chain echoing through the rafters. The massive chandelier, laden with heavy iron and unlit candles, plummeted from the ceiling. It didn't hit the men, it hit the weakened section of the floorboards she knew sat directly above the cavernous wine cellar. With a deafening roar of splintering wood and collapsing masonry, the center of the great hall gave way. Holloway's front line vanished into the dark maw of the cellar, their screams muffled by the settling dust and the secondary collapse of the heavy dining table that followed them down. The magistrate himself barely caught the edge of the pit, his boots dangling over the jagged remains of the floor. Solomon didn't hesitate. He stepped over the wreckage, his sword point coming to rest against Holloway's throat. The Duke's face was a mask of cold, righteous fury, his blood dripping onto the shattered floorboards. "The game has changed, Holloway," Solomon rasped, his voice a lethal whisper. "You came here to find a traitor, but you only succeeded in finding the woman who owns this house and the man who will kill you for her." Frances stood by the wall, her chest heaving, her hands shaking as she watched the remnants of the rebellion crumble. The Duke's gambit had worked, but it wasn't his steel that had won the night, it was the ruined estate she had spent a lifetime protecting. As the dust cleared, she realized that the walls of Elliott Manor weren't just a prison, they were a fortress, and she was its commander. The morning sun broke over the moors with a clarity that seemed to scrub the sky clean, the light pouring into the shattered great hall of Elliott Manor. The violence of the night before had been replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the King's Royal Hussars, their crimson coats a stark contrast to the grey stone as they hauled Holloway and his surviving conspirators away in irons. The evidence Frances had found, the letter of treason, now sat in the hands of the Crown's investigators, a silent witness that had already begun to dismantle the rot within the kingdom. Solomon stood on the front terrace, his traveling cloak draped over the fresh bandages that marked his victory. The carriage bearing the Ashworth seal waited at the foot of the drive, its horses restless in the crisp air. He looked toward the manor, his dark eyes searching the doorway until Frances appeared. She was dressed in her simplest wool, her spine as straight as the ancient oaks that bordered her lands, though her heart felt as fragile as the glass she had spent the morning sweeping away. "The king has received the dispatches," Solomon said, his voice regaining the resonant authority of his title, yet softened by a warmth reserved only for her. "The decree of exile against your father has been formally rescinded. The Elliott name is restored to the rolls of the peerage, and the seized properties in the south will be returned to your family's stewardship by the week's end. You are no longer a ghost in a ruin, Frances. You are lady of the realm once more." Frances looked at the sprawling, decaying estate behind her. For years, this house had been her burden and her bunker, a place of self-sacrificing isolation that had nearly swallowed her whole. "And you, Solomon?" she asked, her voice a soft thread in the morning breeze. "The Duke of Ashworth returns to his palace to be the Iron Duke once more. The mission is over." Solomon stepped across the threshold, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, his hand, no longer the hand of a dying stranger, but that of a man who had found his soul in her care, gently cupping her face. "The mission is over, but the man is changed. I spent my life in a fortress of duty, Francis, thinking that silence was safety. I did not realize I was merely waiting to be found. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in the echoes of the night on the bridge. My palace in the capital is a cold, echoing place. It has many rooms, but none of them have felt like a home until I saw them through the lens of your courage. I am asking you to leave this bedchamber, Francis. Not to escape a scandal, and not to settle a debt. I am asking you to move into mine, as my duchess, and to never let me hide in the dark again. Francis looked into the flinty gray of his eyes and saw a future that didn't involve red-ink ledgers or whispered shames. She had saved a stranger, protected a duke, and in doing so, she had finally liberated herself. The joke of her family's fall had ended in a triumph of the heart. "The carriage is waiting," she murmured, a small, radiant smile finally breaking through her mask of defensive pride. She took his hand, and as they walked toward the waiting horses, leaving the shadows of Elliot Manor behind, Francis knew that the only journey worth taking was the one where she finally stopped hiding and started to live.